So our next speaker is come to us from across the pond in England. He lives in Greenwich. Is Oliver Morton. Oliver, known for quite some time. He got his degree in philosophy and natural history at Cambridge University, which he understands a lot of science, and then started to write books. He wrote a very, very nice book, a cool book called Eating the Sun. I'm jealous of that title. It's about photosynthesis. And he's just finishing a book now on geoengineering, which I'm sure he will inform us about some of his thoughts from that work. Oliver had been for several years an editor at Nature magazine, and then has gone on and now is a writer and editor of science at The Economist, which is probably one of the coolest jobs you can have. So without further ado, Oliver is going to talk to about Anthropocene context for geoengineering. Oliver, welcome.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's not every day that people think that working at The Economist is cool, but I love being in an audience that does. This talk will mark a slight change of pace, if it even starts at all. That button. There we go. This talk will mark a slight change of pace because, as Paul kindly skirted around saying, I'm not an expert, an engineer or a scientist. I've got no particular knowledge of policy, but I do write books occasionally and I talk to people who know stuff, and I have just written a book about geoengineering. I didn't fully get Paul's memo. Could we have a bit less light on the screen? Not that this slide is particularly interesting, but some of the future ones might be. I didn't fully get the memo about geoengineering, so some of what I'm going to say will apply to the forbidden solar methods of geoengineering, in which you try to cut down the world's sunlight. But they also apply to other forms of geoengineering, and they also apply to thinking about the world as an Earth system with active human involvement, even if you don't say the geoengineering word at all. I should just say, because there's a lot of discussion about this sometimes, that for me, geoengineering is a large-scale, deliberate technological intervention in the Earth system. And climate geoengineering, which is not quite the same thing, and we'll come to that later, is a large-scale, deliberate technological intervention in the Earth system, which is designed to decouple cumulative carbon emissions from end climate outcomes. But as I say, I'm not actually going to talk very directly about geoengineering. The important word in the title of this talk is context. And the context I'm taking is quite a broad one. It moves around many centuries. Some of them I will leave to your imagination, but we'll be coming back to the 19th century quite a lot. And the context is the Anthropocene, which is not a term that was used in the 19th century, but one, I think, which has its roots there in various ways. And there are three particular aspects of the Anthropocene context that I want to bring out in this. And one is a changed relationship between humanity and nature. Another is a changed sense of risk in the relationship between humanity and nature. And the third will be a changed mode of intervention between humans and nature. And between them, those should occupy us for a few minutes, and there are at least some moderately pretty pictures, of which this is the first. This is it good, nicely visible? Is it a bit, I can't tell whether that's washed out or not from up here. Anyway, this is a photograph made by Timothy Sullivan, who was a photographer attached to the USGS in the 19th century. And one of the very early founders of American landscape photography. And I chose it to illustrate a lovely line, a lovely quotation from Patricia Limerick, who is a great historian of the West, about the effect of the encounter with the desert, and with the American West more generally, on people of European extraction who had not really seen themselves as living in that sort of place or even traversing that sort of place before. And Patty says, in her book, Desert Passages, the world made few concessions to human needs. The desert had not been made by humans, it firmly resisted being remade by them. And there's this great sense in that picture of, you know, the loneliness and the marginalization of the human. So this 20th century remaking, this is by the landscape photographer Jeff Nixon. This is really archetypal stuff, isn't it? This tells you a little bit about what we think of when we think about remaking nature and about the relationship between the humans and the nature. It's pretty clear here what's human and what's nature. There's a big old line right in the middle that's saying this is the line that matters. And you're getting a very easy distinction between the human and the natural in scale, in definition, in clarity, and of course in direction between this line and the sort of like slightly ominous looming of the mountains behind. And this speaks to what the French anthropologist and sociologist Bruno Latour talks about as the modern settlement, this idea that nature and humans are very different things living in very different worlds that are discussed by very different forms of scientists, very different ways of talking. Latour thinks that this, and I tend to agree with him, is to some extent a fiction that was once necessary and is increasingly by the way. But it is very important about the way that everything up to and including the way our universes are structured, how this works, that we divide this world up between the lines and the holes. The lines do not have to be, I'm going to have to get used to holding this, aren't I? The lines don't have to be horizontal, they can be vertical. This is a monument to what the scholar David Nye has called the technological sublime. The lines, you notice, at this time go up, not along. Well, some of them go along, but the up is very important. The sublime, as it exists in the discourse of art and the humanities in the 19th century in England and elsewhere, is very much about the confrontation of man and nature, the confrontation between that which one can grasp with the intellect and that which one feels, the idea of fear which can be replaced by knowing what's going on that lifts you to some extent above the fear, the idea of peril recollected in tranquility. These are the ideas that go into sublime. David Nye talks about, in a very excellent book of the same name, talks about the technological sublime, particularly as an American contribution to this way of thinking. And in the technological sublime, nature is no longer the other against which humans measure themselves. Humans measure themselves against that which they themselves do. And the infinite is no longer an absolute bar, because there's a sense in the technological sublime that anything is possible, that man's ability to be his own other, to be humanity's other, makes the future almost unlimited. And this is a very powerful idea that you get. Nye talks about things like the Boulder Dam or the Saturn V rocket as these great instantiations of the technological sublime. I've chosen this not just because I commute to work past it in the morning, but because this is the Bankside Power Station. It was the last great industrial building built in London. It was also the first building in London to have the temerity to try and be taller than St. Paul's Cathedral. So there's a monument to its sublimity. It, in the end, was not taller than St. Paul's Cathedral quite, and if I run short in this talk, which I assure you is not very likely, I can tell you the fun story about why that is. But there we are. That's the Bankside Power Station. That's a picture from about 1956. And then here we have the lines taking over. This is a piece by Mitch Epstein. It's a picture of a power plant called Amos. And here you see the landscape has gone completely. Now we just have human technology lines. We have this sense of awesome power from which we can barely discern anything natural at all. And the things that we were hearing about from Steve and Granger this morning kind of beggar the imagination to some extent, and the few numbers in this talk, you will have gathered that this talk is rather more visual than it is numerate, or at least numerical, actually possibly both. To put some numbers on what you're seeing here, humans are emitting 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year from industrial processes. They are burning 3 trillion cubic meters of gas a year. They are burning 3 billion barrels of oil a month, and they are burning 300 tons of coal a second. Quite remarkable power, in more than one sense of the word, which contribute to the idea, I think, are the founding base of the idea of the Anthropocene, because what you're seeing in burning coal at this sort of rate is that humans now burn coal at, roughly speaking, 1 million times the speed at which the planet makes coal, or made coal, back when it was in the coal-making business. And this is where we get into the idea of the Anthropocene, of the age of man, a term which, though not coined by, was widely promulgated by Paul Crutzen around 2000, 2002, the idea that humans no longer live in the Holocene epoch, but they live in an epoch of their own making, which he called the Anthropocene. You can see the evidence, one would say, everywhere: the composition of the atmosphere, the chemistry of the oceans, the rates of sedimentation, the forms of rock that are being created at the moment, the distribution of species, the diversity of species, and thus the course of evolution. Humans have a strong, possibly dominant role in all of those things. Well, dominant in certainly some of those things. And thus you get this idea that we have to take some level of ownership or responsibility for the Anthropocene. There's a whole detailed debate, by the way, which I'm not sure I'm going to have time to get into, about the question of where the Anthropocene starts. There's a more interesting question, I think, possibly, about the real extent of the Anthropocene. Wally Brooker argues that the Anthropocene, for those of you who are of a geological turn of mind, is to vastly underplay what we're talking about here, and that what we're actually talking about is an Anthropozoic, that this is a whole new era of life based on the fact that humans have found themselves sources of energy to which life has never previously had access, both nuclear energy, which we were just hearing about, but also the stored energy of hundreds of millions of years of plant life. And so that's a much bigger sort of a boundary, the boundary of an Anthropozoic era. It also leads to a rather disturbing thought. The last era level boundary is the 166 million years ago, between the Mesozoic and the Paleogene. This is a boundary that's quite famous, probably the most famous geological boundary there is. Here it is. Now, below you have the Mesozoic, above you have the Paleogene. The question about the Anthropozoic here is, does the Anthropozoic represent a whole huge set of strata racing on up into history? Or does it represent just that line there, which is the fallout from a huge asteroid impact? So are humans like the future, or are they like the thing that wipes out everything, gets out of the way, and has the future after it? That's possibly the most dramatic way of looking at the Anthropocene question. But I want to get back to the 19th century and get back to this idea of how we feel about the Anthropocene. And the 19th century is, above almost anything else, except possibly imperialism, the 19th century is the century of the steam engine. And the world is changed by steam engines. And the engine that changes the world changes the way people see the world. We invent, especially scientists and engineers, invent the modern notion of the system in order to understand the machine and to understand the world and to understand the two as part of each other. We saw a great example of this actually in those Livermore figures that Granger showed us. This is in fact the first version of such a figure where the size of a flow is represented by the width of the arrow that represents that flow. These are diagrams by Captain Matthew Sankey of the British Army, who was using them to make choices between different designs of steam engines, and he wanted to plot everything out. Anyone who looks at something like Kevin Trendworth's diagrams of how energy flows through the Earth system, or those Lawrence Livermore diagrams, knows that this is how we now think about both the machines with which we change the world and the world that the machines change. It is, however, not, though I think rather fascinating, and also in some absolutely wonderfully absurd units. I think it's in thousands of BTU per inch per hour or something like that. It's a wonderfly arcane system. Anyway, it's not the most lovely. Here's a much more lovely representation of what's going on in the 19th century. This is J.M.W. Turner. This is a paper called this is a picture called Rain, Steam and Speed. And here you're beginning to see Turner is the first artist, first great artist certainly, to be absolutely fascinated by steam, by the power of steam, by the notion of the world as being reinvigorated by steam. And you've got this great example here where you still have this idea, you still have, and I was pleased to think of this, you still have this line running through the landscape, but at the same time, the distinction between the rain and the steam is beginning to be very hard to see. The distinction between the world and the thing changing the world is getting harder to see. You've got that even more clearly in this absolute masterpiece, which is called Snowstorm. And here this is a picture you can only paint, if you're Turner, not only with the advent of steam, but with your willingness to tie yourself to the mast of a steamship and be in a storm and see what the engines of nature feel like when you are propelled through them by the engines of human progress, and put yourself out there and at the same time in there and experience the world through and as a machine. And then just the last bit of Turner, because I couldn't resist. This is a piece called Goethes Theory, and there's a very influential reading of this piece by a historian called Jonathan Crary, where he says, here you see, this is the ultimate version of Turner's vision, in which you cannot see where the light is coming from. You cannot actually distinguish whether you are seeing light, whether you're seeing the sun, or whether you're seeing, or whether this is the act of seeing, whether this is in fact the eye. It's a wonderfully oblique picture, a picture that lives around its own edges. And that, I wanted to bring this up because, to me, that's what that 19th century experience of the proto-Anthropocene, this idea of a world changed by steam engines and changing into a steam engine, this ends up putting us right into the middle of the system. We can't just stand back and look at the Sankey diagrams. Those arrows and flows of nature and energy flow through us, constitute us, and we constitute them. There's no longer a way of making those hard boundary lines between the natural and the human. So from this representation of the sun to this picture of the sun, can anyone tell me, this looks like a classic version like that Jeff Nixon I showed you earlier. This looks like a classic version of the American West. You have the mountains in the distance, the human line running through. Can anyone tell me what's unusual about this picture of the American West? Who was that? Yeah. That's right. This is a test in the John series, and this is in fact a nuclear blast mimicking the sun. One way of seeing this is you can see that in fact the shadows on the scrub is pointing away. This is a blast, a very small nuclear weapon pretending to be the sun, which is to me one of the most. I mean, it's far, far smaller than the nuclear test pictures that you're used to, but it's wonderfully redolent, and it tells us something about it tells me something about the second part of what I want to say about Anthropocene contexts for thinking about how the world gets changed, which is that they come from 1945 onwards tinged with the feeling of the apocalypse. There is a sense in which the modern world that can be changed only becomes a world that can be changed on a global scale by human endeavor because it has become a world, or as part of the process of becoming a world which is permanently at risk. It doesn't necessarily always feel like that. These guys are standing right below that picture that we were just seeing, looking up at it, and they don't seem to be particularly concerned. But many of us over the years have been in various ways concerned about this, and a lot of how we think about the environment is shaped by this. There is what's sometimes called a catastrophic turn of the imagination around 1970, where people start thinking about the world as a thing that can end, as a thing that can break, as a thing that can be ruptured. This is not, some argue, purely the fact that they see nukes and think, oh, that might apply more generally. There's a sense in which, there's a fascinating book by a historian called Jacob Hamlin called Arming Mother Nature, about the ways in which people consciously took ways of destroying the world geophysically in the 1950s and 60s and examined them. So, for instance, there are papers on not on how to worry about ozone holes, but how to make an ozone hole just where you'd want it over your enemy, and that sort of idea. So environmentalism comes with this catastrophic tinge in the 1970s, and there's a strong sense, I think, in which the catastrophic imagination, which is linked, I think, to what Ulrich Beck talks about as the risk society, there's a strong sense in which that carries on today. When we think about the future of the environment, it is very easy, almost, I think, temptingly and damagingly easy to think in terms of utter destruction rather than change and degradation. And to some extent, the other point is that when you look at a dawn, a false dawn, you could say like this, you realize that in many ways, because of its seemingly ultimate power, nuclear stands in for all technology. And that means imagining making a good Anthropocene, as a phrase you sometimes hear thrown around these days. A good Anthropocene is a very hard sell if part of what you think about with the Anthropocene is the idea of the world ending. If part of what you think about is that we're not all the strata going on up, but just the level of clay after which everything else gets on with it. And this is a particular problem. I mean, I would say that's a general problem with thinking about what it is to be part of a planet on an Earth system scale and try and do something about it. It's a particular problem for geoengineering because the idea that you can use human power to change the climate deliberately is very much an idea which in the 20th century goes hand in hand with ideas about nuclear power and nuclear destruction. The first time it's given voice is by the great chemist Frederick Soddy in his lectures on the interpretation of radium in 1906, when he talks about how he's trying to get across the sheer power of the energy locked up in radium, and talks about the power to transform a desert continent, to thaw the frozen poles, to make the whole world one smiling Garden of Eden. And, you know, you can go to Lawrence Livermore and still hear people talking like that. And this is partly because one of Soddy's most diligent readers was H.G. Wells, who uses very much, I mean, his great book, The World Set Free, is more, well, it's not by any means one of his best novels, but it's a very influential work. It's almost like just sort of like playing out the Soddy hypotheses about what nuclear power mean. And H.G. Wells is read by, well, basically everyone in the first part of the 20th century, and so you get things like this. This is the cover of Popular Mechanics in 1946, and they're not, and you want to say that this is just ludicrous, this idea of just we should nuke the Arctic and turn it into a nice open sea in which we could all go swimming. And it is, when it comes down to it, ludicrous. But at the same time, this is a report not of a complete crackpot, but of the head of UNESCO, Julian Huxley, a senior person in the reimagining of the world that's going on at that point in the United Nations. And he's doing this as part of an idea that the world can be governed differently, that there can be Waldemar Kampfert, who was the science editor of the New York Times, which is a cool job, at the time, talked about how this was part of Huxley's, part of being the social planning on a worldwide basis. And we should also remember that Huxley thinks that social planning should not just extend to the ability to remove the ice from the Arctic, but also the ability to tell people what sort of children to have. He's part of the British tradition, the minor British tradition of eugenicists. This isn't what anyone who's talking about geoengineering today is really talking about, but it's very much the legacy that they have to live with. The very nature of the power involved when you talk about deliberately changing the climate in the world that has had the history that our world has had since 1945 cannot not have the mushroom cloud hanging over it. And that's a fundamental problem that I think all discussion, certainly of sunlight geoengineering, I think that plays much less if you're talking about carbon dioxide recovery, but fundamentally for ways of deliberately changing the climate, that image is always going to be strong. But, this is my third example, there is a certain social planning on a worldwide basis that can be done in a more ad hoc way, where this is just another excuse to put another nice piece of art up, really. But this is Walter de Mauer's magnificent installation piece, Lightning Field, which is an array of spikes 1 mile long and 1 kilometer across, which sometimes, you have to be very lucky, draws down lightning. It's a great visual, conceptual representation of the technological sublime, but I put it up here because I'm about to do something ludicrously silly, which is talk about nitrogen fixation with Paul in the audience. Over here on the left, we have some nitrogen fixation going on in lightning. That was when life started on the planet, more or less the only nitrogen fixation game in town. Then the bacteria got in on the act and were able to do, in tiny little blobby cells at room temperature, what it takes lightning to do in the atmosphere, which I think is quite a remarkable thing. So let's hear it for some cyanobacteria, which you've got here. And although they're not the only nitrogen fixers, for about 3.5 billion years, that was how the Earth system did nitrogen. I mean, where the bacteria lived changed from time to time, but that was basically the deal when it came to nitrogen, that the nitrogen fixers would fix it from the atmosphere, everyone else would use it, eventually some denitrifiers would put it back in the atmosphere, that was it. And then the 19th century happened, and the humans said, well, I'm not sure about this. That doesn't sound very good. In particular, a man called William Crookes, who is one of the people who first observes helium on Earth, and gives a famous presidential address to the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1896, in which he doesn't talk about helium or anything quite so highfalutin, and instead talks an awful lot about manure and bird shit, because he's very worried about the nitrogen crisis. Nitrogen is necessary for wheat. White men, and he's very specific about gender and race here, need wheat. Apparently he thinks everyone else can get by without it, but apparently British people need wheat. They also need a Royal Navy which needs gunpowder, which also needs nitrates, and we're running out. And our ability to manufacture wars in South America in order to take over the nitrate supply, as we've been doing for the last few decades, will at some point no longer serve its purpose. And so men of science, again, his gendered term, must put themselves together and get cracking and work out how to fix nitrogen better than the microbes. It had just been discovered that the microbes have been doing it all the time, but they weren't up to the job, Crookes thought, and so we need to get going. And these gentlemen do get going. That's Karl Bosch and Fritz Haber, who between 1908 and 1913 developed modern nitrogen fixation. And this goes on to change the conditions of human life on the planet. Not immediately, but fairly quickly, certainly quickly by geological terms. So we go from having a nitrate trade of 1 million tons or so there to having now, today, 120 million tons of commercial nitrate fixation in the world. So we are way outstripping what humans used to do. We are actually now outstripping what the microbes on the continents do. If you bring in the microbes in the ocean, which of course we should, because microbes in the ocean are very important, you will find that we don't quite outnumber everyone, but we're pretty close. So in terms of the human influence on a fundamental biogeochemical cycle, what humans are doing to the nitrogen cycle is far, far greater than what they're doing to the carbon cycle. This is to me, the great Anthropocene change, is this huge intervention in an earthly biogeochemical cycle, which is also a huge intervention in human history. It's so huge that the fact that nitrogen fixation is one of the, along with the internal combustion engine, one of the two things that allows you to fight world wars, which had not previously been possible, that's only the second most important thing about nitrogen fixation, because it also allows you to support populations far higher than anyone could have supported previously. This is all, you may be saying, what does this have to do with, well, who knows what you may be saying, I won't go there. But you may be, I would wonder whether you would be asking yourself, this is all very well, but what does it have to do with geoengineering? I contend that in terms of making a large-scale deliberate intervention in the Earth system, nitrogen fixation is actually the best worked example that human history has to offer, because it's not like agriculture or the emission of polluting sulfates. It's not something that just happens when humans were getting on with other stuff. This is something which is deliberate policy. It's something where you have people like Crookes, where you have Crookes standing up and telling the scientists of his country and the world, this is what you need to be doing. This is a global crisis. We need a technological fix. Go to it. They do. And then it's not just that the market says, oh, well, that's quite interesting. Nitrogen fixation is intensely political through all the 20th century. If you've got, this is a French poster for nitrogen, for a combined fertilizer. This is from 1922 or 23, I think. It's quite important. You should notice the faint image of a V, the triangle that's holding him. This is partly, I think, a symbol of victory, because nitrogen fixation is one of the spoils of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles tells the Germans that nitrogen fixation is now something that all the winners get to take away free. And so we're taking all your technology for doing this. You can go on doing it, but we want that because we can make ammunition with it. We can also make fertilizer with it. The Rockefeller Foundation in the 1940s works very, very hard on breeding new plants which can use nitrogen better. This is what Norman Borlaug's project is in Mexico. This is what's going to go on to be the project that in many ways feeds the developing world in the second half of the 20th century, when the developing world is growing at it, when the population of the developing world is growing at its fastest. And some of us are fairly familiar with the Green Revolution story here. I think people are not quite so familiar with the fact that when the Green Revolution is given its name by William Gord, who's the head of USAID at the time, he's not just saying green plants, green, yay, go green. He's saying this is a green revolution that's being had as an alternative to a red revolution. The Green Revolution is an instrument of power in Asia to make sure that Asian peasants get well fed and don't become communists, except for those who already are communists, who, in this rather lovely, this is 1972, this is to some extent the beginning of China's economic growth story that we're now seeing today. This is the large-scale embrace of nitrate fertilizers in China. So there's something very deliberate, not at a unified UN level, but big global players such as Lyndon Johnson are consciously guiding the way that humanity takes over the nitrogen cycle. And we could get into a big question here about the good and bad of that. I tend to think that by providing the wherewithal for people who were born in the 1960s and 50s, including me, to eat without ripping up forests similar in area to twice the size of India, which is what you would have to do with old-fashioned yields if you were trying to feed the world as that we have today. I'm sorry, that sentence was ludicrously complicated. Nitrogen has allowed us to spare an awful lot of land from the plough, and it has allowed us to save an awful lot of lives by so doing. It has also caused an awful lot of environmental harm. But one of the key things, and this is where I am getting then, it's improvable. There are people around the world, there may well be people here today, who are devoting their lives to a mixture of better regulation, better technology, better imagination, better social standards, social obligations that will increase the responsibility that humans feel when they engineer the nitrogen cycle. And that takes me into my concluding thought about geoengineering, which is that when you let intentionality into the Earth system, you do something very, very radical. And geoengineering, of course, has to do that, because intentions change. What people want to do with things over time changes. You saw this picture earlier. In 1950, what my father's generation wanted to do with this was burn fuel oil. Now what we do with it is go and visit art, because this power station in the centre of London hasn't been a power station since 1974, but since about 15 years ago has been one of the world's great contemporary art museums, the Tate Museum. And I wanted to finish with a picture from another picture like Turner's picture and like that extraordinary picture of the John nuclear test, another human reimagining of the sun. This is a piece by an Icelandic artist called Ólafur Eliasson. It's in the turbine hall of Tate Modern. An extraordinarily unforgiving artistic space in that it is vast, impersonal, industrial. Eliasson chose to recreate the sun. He did it, and this would be nice in a talk that was more about geoengineering, this one has been. He did it with mirrors. What he's done is mirrored the ceiling all the way along this 200-meter hall, and so from wherever you look in the hall, you see that sun, which is an artificial half-sun, suspended above you. And it was a huge public success. The image of the sun has always been a religious image. It's also always been an image of the sublime. And this is just something from something I wrote about at the time, that this is a very unusual sublime. It's enclosed and not open. The great electric architecture of the building stands for the human power to encompass everything, even the weather, even the sun, with the human mind. And to see not just the sun, but ourselves in the sun. This was what was fascinating about this piece. Everyone looked at the sun. Everyone also looked up at themselves in the mirror. Everyone looked at each other in the mirror and on the ground. It was an extraordinary representation of solidarity. It was something that one experienced with other people and was part of the making of in a very small way. And I don't propose this as a metaphor or a model for Anthropocene geoengineering, or even for thinking about the place of humans in nature more generally. But I do represent it as, to some extent, an inspiration. So I'll leave you with that, except I'll actually leave you with this. You can read more about this in this book that's coming out later this year, or in this country, actually, early next year. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a couple of questions. Students, anybody? Students first? Start with this gentleman.
We could take the light up now, then I could...
Great talk, Oliver. Question I had then, and this really touches upon some of your final few slides. When we think of geoengineering, we automatically, I do at least, start to think of affecting the radiation balance and chemical composition of the atmosphere. But if we think more broadly, and I'm wondering, as part of your research for this book, where do you see synthetic biology as kind of playing a, coming to the table and coming to discussion as, I would say an emerging technology? We're certainly kind of in the early stages, but I think there's certainly a place for it. So I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are around the role of synthetic biology.
I don't think of synthetic biology very strongly in terms of actually trying to use it in a geoengineering context, but I think of it absolutely as part of the same discourse about what it is, about how humans should or shouldn't meddle in, improve, change, and accept their role in nature. I mean, when you look at how synthetic biology is at the ecosystem level today, you have to accept that an awful lot of this has already gone on. I did at one point actually think about writing a book that was about both of them, and then I decided that would be just doubly ludicrous to try and bite off that much. I think that it speaks to very similar issues, and I think it's also very interesting in the context of some of the artwork I was pointing to. There's both geoengineering and synthetic biology attract a certain type of modern conceptual artist in a way that I think is very interesting. That would be something for another talk. I don't think engineering life forms to be much better carbon sinks at the moment, or, God knows, to be very reflective, is a very useful technological strategy at the moment, but I think that that way of thinking about the world is very much linked to this.
Okay, anybody else? Well, thank you very much, all of you.